Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
For everyone that's listening, I'm very excited. This is way, way long overdue. And I am excited today to announce that I think this is going to be a very regular thing for us. I am thrilled to be here today with Richard Sullivan, who is our general counsel at Gibson Sotheby's International Realty. I will let him introduce himself. Richard's an incredible person to work with, an incredible resource for all of our agents. I think the differentiator for us, I would say, and I don't know if you agree, a lot of bigger companies have general counsel for the company, where we have general counsel, obviously for us, but for everybody. You're constantly talking to all of our agents every single day. And that's just, I think, a resource that we have that really, I don't know that anyone really has at our size. So, and especially with all the knowledge that you have. So could you introduce yourself just to kick us off?
Sure. By way of background, I was working construction when the market tanked back in the 1990s, and I decided I would go to law school. And the one thing I knew is I didn't want to be a real estate attorney, but life throws you curveballs. I ended up being the inside counsel for the Greater Boston Association of Realtors and Greater Boston Real Estate Board for about 4.5 years. And then I was in private practice for 17 years, where I was representing buyers, sellers, lenders, and real estate brokers and developers. So my whole focus was real estate related. And then almost 6 years ago, the owners of Gibson Sotheby's invited me in, and I became in-house counsel for the Greater Boston for Gibson Sotheby's. And it's been great representing the company and the agents. We've overseen some growth here. We started with 7 offices, and now we're up to 27. So it's been an exciting 6 years.
For sure. Thank you. I know your background could go on and on, but I know I learned so much from you. And like I said, this is kind of overdue to have this conversation. And I think the way it came about really is in most of our sales meetings, you end up telling stories. And I think that's really what resonates. It's what resonates with me, but with our agents. And I think that it would be so incredible if our agents could have those stories to sort of bottle up and share with their sphere. Because while a lot of the things that you're seeing probably get smarter, I think that things are pretty consistent. So once you sort of have that story in your head, it will be a red flag for next time. So I am excited to tell everyone that we will be doing these regularly. So I get to hear from you all the time on what's going on, what's coming across our desk in terms of, well, everything legal. But today we're going to focus on scamming, online fraud, something that we're seeing so much of, sadly. And while it's not a light topic at all, I think that hearing some stories, some are crazy and some aren't that crazy, but hearing some stories might stop just 1 or 2 people that listen to this from getting caught up in something, because most of these things, like I said, while they're getting more and more smart, it still looks about the same, right? The red flags feel about the same. And like I said, I get to hear those from you all the time. And this has been overdue because we have so much we could talk about. But I think what we decided was let's do a couple short anecdotal topic specific on what are you seeing, what's trending, as ridiculous as that sounds right now, in terms of one specific topic. So today we're going to dive into what are we seeing in terms of scams, fraud, and sadly, I know it's on the uptick, which it has been for years.
Right. And I'd put them in 3 categories. It's going to be rentals, or it's going to be real estate sales or real estate purchases. They're either targeting the seller or they're targeting the buyer. But the easy one, and this is something that is happening right now and really took off during COVID, is the rental scams, because people are used to looking online. And the problem we have as an industry is there are people out there who are hoping to avoid the real estate broker's commission. So they go online to a Craigslist or something like that. And what the scammers do is go to Zillow or to our websites, download pictures, and then advertise a property that might be for sale. So it looks beautiful. And it's a great rent, almost too good to be true. So the people are rushing to see it. And the respondent, the scammer is saying to them, we have a lot of interest. If we're going to secure this property for you, or even a showing for you, you have to submit an application and give us $300 or a small amount. And then all of a sudden they send the money and they send the application. And in some cases, they find out they're approved. We had one where the lease came in under a different name, and all of a sudden the person started to question it. In another, it was just everything dried up and the communication dried up. And then they start looking around the internet and reach out to us and say, hey, we rented that place and you're selling it. And we have to tell them, no, it's never been for rent. And they'll start asking, what about the money I sent? That's gone. We don't have it, it's just gone. But the bigger thing is, did you submit an application? Because now you've just provided some real estate scammer your bank account information, your social security number, your last couple of addresses, and you have bigger problems than just the couple of bucks you may have sent to the scammer, because you've set yourself up for identity fraud. And we constantly will reach out to the Mass Association of Realtors and the Greater Boston Real Estate Board and ask them to go to the media. But this story can only run so often from the media. So it really is something that needs to be repeated. If you have kids who are going to a different town or a different state and they're looking to rent someplace, tell them to go to a broker, and at least then, fee or no fee, it's going to be real estate and it's going to be a real landlord behind this. So that's a big one that we have very little control over.
Yeah, and the urgency is, I think, where the opportunity lies. The urgency and the scarcity. And we're not the only market like this. The rental market's so competitive right now. I know friends moving all over, into New York and things like that. I mean, that's always been a really competitive rental market. But I think that's where you have to take a step back, because even when it's competitive and even when it's urgent, you really have to think about that. But that's where the scammers, I think, are getting in, is it is so competitive. It is so urgent. And people aren't being taken aback by this need for immediacy. We need to hear back from you right away. We need to get a deposit in from you. Even if it's a small deposit, we're seeing that, right? Like, if you put this down now, we can get you the first showing. And now a couple $100 is gone. Might not seem like the end of the world, but at the same time, it stinks. And we don't like seeing anybody go through that. So not even if the situation is urgent, that's what I'm taking out of that, not letting yourself get caught up, and just being sure there's always, in the state of Massachusetts, there's always a brokerage listed. There's always an agent's name listed. Obviously, if you're trying to get around a brokerage, you may not have that, but you should always pick up the phone and call that brokerage if you see them associated at all, before you send money, of course.
Well, and especially if you see that it has a real estate broker's name and a company in the Craigslist listing, right, but the email is going to either a Craigslist blind email or it's going to a Gmail or a Yahoo. Stop. That doesn't look right. Call the brokerage and ask for the person, because chances are, whether it's, Gibson, Sotheby's or some other company, they're going to have a company email address, not just, a Gmail or a Yahoo or a blind address.
Right. So rentals are a big one to watch out for. Now, in terms of sales, I know we didn't mention this to start, but there's almost scams for the agents that we want to make sure we touch on. And there's been really interesting land that feels new to me this year, the scams that are going on in terms of selling land in specific markets that we're in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. And this is one of the things you'll typically see this with land as opposed to a house, because if somebody contacts a listing broker and wants to sell their house, the listing broker needs to see the property, see the condition. Whereas if it's just a piece of real estate, the real estate agent can drive by anytime and look at it and pull the public record and say, okay, it's 1.5 acres on this street. Here's the tax ID. This is the owner. And we don't need to get into the property or worry about that type of thing. So what will happen is somebody will go to the public record, they'll check the registry of deeds, they'll check the town records and make sure that who is the owner of record, what state are they from, and then they will email the real estate broker and say, I need to sell this property and I need to sell it quick, and if the broker looks it up, they say, well, the name matches the deed at the registry of deeds and the town records for the tax records. So this probably is legitimate. But the scammers know that, and what they will try to do at all, kind of what they are trying to do is move quickly. I need you to get this listed. There's a family emergency. We need to sell the property very quickly. So, send me the listing agreement. I'll sign it, no problem. And what they're going for is a quick hit of a large amount of money. So this property maybe is worth $450,000. They're willing to sell it for $375,000. They have somebody who's going to prepare a fake driver's license, a fake deed, and a fake notary certificate. And they notarize a deed and a power of attorney and send it off. And then they get wired the money. Then they close that account and move quickly before someone realizes it. And it could be months before the real buyer drives by that property and finds out that somebody is starting to either clear the land or has submitted applications for building permits. And all of a sudden they're saying, wait a minute, what's going on? That scammer is gone. That money the buyer paid is gone. And it's not coming back. So the buyer paid good money and they don't get title to the property. Those cases, and we've had our agents get contacted with them. What we say is when you get that email right away, you have to do your due diligence. You've looked at the registry of deeds, you've looked at the tax information. Now Google, look at LinkedIn, check Facebook. Who is this person? And especially if they say, I'm a doctor at this hospital, look up the picture, and maybe you reach out to them at that phone number, or you reach out to them at their work email and say, I'm just confirming that you want to list the property at this address. Alternatively, and what we encourage for all our agents, whether they're working with buyers or sellers, is we need a face-to-face meeting. And we can have a Zoom meeting, we can have a FaceTime meeting, but we have to meet face-to-face. And sometimes what we see is when the agent says, due to the prevalence of fraud, we have to have a face-to-face meeting, the last thing the fraudster wants is an opportunity for their face to be on screen where a screenshot can be taken, and they just move on to the next potential victim of their crime.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I think that's the big takeaway in terms of like being a listing agent. It's crazy what we have to watch out for now and the extra steps we have to take. And I think that everything got very common over, COVID, just with sight unseen, like you said, just drive by, doing that Zoom, making sure you're setting up that meeting. But really that face-to-face meetings is just a great golden rule. Try as hard as you can because they're just not going to show up for it if they're going to scam you, and you're going to save yourself a lot of time. And we have seen this. Luckily, we haven't seen it carry through, but we've seen people reaching out trying to fraudulently sell land in a couple of our markets, which is insane to me. If you could explain with that, the buy side scams, because I think a lot of people don't even understand, like, what are you gaining, right? Like, are you ever going to get to the finish line? But they don't even really necessarily need to get to the closing.
Right.
Can you walk us through some of the buy side scams we're seeing?
Sure. And what we're seeing with the buy side is, and what I was told when I was a young lawyer, there are no emergencies in the law, and really it applies to real estate. There are no emergencies in real estate. And when there's an emergency, that should send up a red flag. What is it that suddenly has to happen within 24 hours and why? And what we will see is somebody will submit a check for a purchase or ask for wire instructions. And a lot of the times, you're the listing agent and you get contacted via email by somebody who's overseas. And because they're overseas, they can't have a Zoom and they can't meet with you, but they have $3 million that they want to wire to buy this property. And all they need is your wire instructions. And the real estate agents will just start slow walking that right away. Well, do you have an agent? Do you have a lawyer? And in Massachusetts, we don't use title companies. In other states, it could be the seller's title insurance company that's handling this. In Massachusetts, it's going to be the buyer's attorney. So we push them back. You have to have a buyer's attorney. Whether you're financing it or not, there has to be an attorney who represents you, who is going to do this, but they're looking to sometimes send a wire and then call it back. And there are ACH transfers. And the ACH transfers will allow 24 to 36 hours of a reverse of the wire. So in those cases, what they're trying to do is maybe they say, we're going to send $1.5 million, and they accidentally send 1.8. And it appears in the account as 1.8 and says, well, send us back the 300,000. So you've got 1.8 in your account and you send them back 300,000, and then they recall the ACH and they pull the whole 1.8 out of your account. So now you've been scammed for $300,000 in an escrow account, and that's a big problem. And what they will do is start moving the money right away, because they're not supposed to be able to just willy-nilly recall funds. But once they've recalled it and moved the money, it's gone. So that's one of the scams. The other is basically fraudulent certified checks. And, typically people will look at a certified check and say, well, it's certified funds, it's good funds. So we had an incident where we had a purchase and sale agreement signed with certified funds sent to us by a certified check. And when we or any other broker deposit a certified check, 24 hours later, the bank makes the full amount available to you. Even though they're still waiting to hear back from the bank, because it's certified funds, it's treated as good funds. And what we'll see with that is the buyer submits a fraudulent certified check, and then the following day, there's suddenly an emergency. There was a car accident, my wife was killed, my child was killed, one's in the hospital, I need that money back right away. Please tell the seller to release the money back to me. And right away, here's your emergency. And it's emotional. It'll pull at your heartstrings. This poor buyer lost their spouse. They lost a child. They need their money. And let's release the money back to them. And we, as brokers in the industry, have to say, stop right there. What are the likelihood of that happening? And in the case where we had that happen, the seller's attorney was suspicious and he told us not to release the money. But I had already reached out to our accounting department, who called our bank, who called the issuing bank. And while I'm on the phone with the seller's attorney who says this doesn't sound right, I get an email confirming that the check was basically a counterfeit check and there was no money in the account. So that's kind of the scam. And what you'll see on all these scams is there's a sudden rush. All of a sudden, something fast has to happen. All of a sudden, the transaction picked up speed. And for us as a company, we have very experienced agents who have been doing this for a while, and they don't even recognize what the issue is, but they say something doesn't sound right, and they call me right away. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we would say for any agent. Real estate is a process. It's not instantaneous. You're not ordering coffee. You're not ordering fast food. This is a process, and it's going to take some time. And there are other real estate professionals involved. Typically, there's going to be a lender. There are going to be attorneys for both the buyer and the seller. All of this may slow it down a little bit, but all of this is for the protection of all the consumers involved as well. So what we try to do when somebody tries to speed up the process is to really kind of slow walk and say, well, why did this emergency suddenly appear?
Mm-hmm. For sure. And watching out for emails getting hacked. I think that's another thing that obviously that we've seen, but we're saying make sure you're hearing from your agent and things like that, but just knowing that there's a lot of times that hackers are on somebody's, right? They're on the client, they're on the attorneys on one side or the other. They're on one of the agents, and they're watching the whole time. They have all the information. They're watching, they're waiting for their moment to say, this thing happened. And again, it's always urgency. And we need you to do this right now. And I think that this is a weird comparison to make, but I was just thinking, I'm about to have my second baby. And they always say, like, when you're in a medical situation, right? Like if you were to have a baby in the hospital, when someone recommends something to you from a medical standpoint, it feels like an emergency right away. and like asking that question, like, is this something we need to do right now? And that's what I think. It's like, it's the same mindset. What are my other options? Is this really an emergency? Because nothing should feel like an emergency. Of course, there's emergencies, there's things that comes up, but typically it's not a time emergency. You always have a minute. An agent's never going to email you like, you need to do this wire right now. You are always going to have a minute to take a step back and be like, do I? What are my other options? My other options are to call the brokerage and say, is this real? What is the reason for this? And maybe there is something, right? And then you will have that education and you can do it. But I think the urgency is like the big thing I want everybody to take out of this, because that's usually when we see things go wrong. They create a sense of urgency, this feeling of chaos. I'm going to lose the house. We've been in such a competitive market. That's where people are making mistakes, instead of saying, your email might have been hacked. I need to make a phone call before I send that wire.
I think, and this is something we do with, we have a wire fraud that warns people about this. And this is a big money transaction. And this is why the fraudsters focus on real estate, because you can really get a big hit on a single transaction. And, all they need to do is get into somebody's email and they can forward the email. So it could be the attorneys, it could be the brokers, it could be the lender, or it could just be the consumer. And a lot of the time it's the consumer, because they're the weakest link. We as an industry are focused on people are trying to steal from us, so we better make sure we take these steps. But for instance, we had a transaction where, the buyer was working with the lender had an attorney, the attorney notified the buyer about the wire instructions. And then the morning of the closing, the attorney's office emailed the buyer saying, we've changed our wire instructions. Please send it here. Now, she had talked to the attorney. They had emailed back and forth. And she said, I've got the 11 o'clock walkthrough at the property. I have the 12 o'clock closing in your office. So I'll be going out to the bank at 10 o'clock to issue the wire. So now the fraudster knows exactly what to do in the timeline. And immediately, first thing in the morning, they send the email saying, we hope we caught you before you went to the bank. Please send the wire to this address. And they spoofed the email of the attorney. So the buyer gets that. She goes to the bank. She wires off the money. And then she goes to the closing. The sellers present the deed. The buyer says, we've initiated the wire, but the closing attorney doesn't have it yet. That's not unusual. They close waiting for the wire to come in. And then by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they realize that there is no wire, and they realize that somebody's been hacked. In this place, it was the consumer. Her email had been entered and they forwarded the email so the fraudster could sit outside the transaction and wait and watch to send that email. And, we as the industry, all the brokers were running to check theirs, all the attorneys are running to check their emails. And unfortunately, the consumer was out the cost of the property or the deposit, which was in excess of $80,000 that they had wired and they wouldn't see. Another thing that we warn people about is holiday weekends, because this happened before a holiday weekend. And what fraudsters like to do is, if I can get this wire sent on a Friday before a holiday weekend, offices are closing early, banks are closing early, and then by the time I get the money, I can start moving it and I can move it offshore. So by the time the consumer realizes they've been scammed, maybe the bank has been closed and it's not going to be open until the following Tuesday. We're not really going to have staff on Saturday, and no one's going to be there on Monday. So it gives the scammers the opportunity to move the money that much more out of reach of the consumers and of the law enforcement trying to chase that money down.
Right. For sure. It's horrible. I hate these stories. But that was the last thing I wanted to touch on, and you did it, was just the holiday weekend thing. Because again, it's urgency and we see it all the time. We remind people every holiday weekend to keep an eye out for anything that might be going out. So I don't know, did you have any other stories you wanted to share or any other trends you're seeing?
Well, I will tell you, from the point of view of the broker, we had an agent who was, had a buyer and they gave him the fraud disclosure about you're going to get wire instructions and no one's changing it via email. Once we give this to you, it won't change. And we use a secured email so that it's outside of the scope. Mm-hmm. And this buyer bought their property, and then about 6 months later, they were going to buy a car rather. And the morning of the day they were going to pick it up, they got an email from the car dealer saying the wire instructions had changed. And something triggered in their memory about, gee, I remember getting a warning about this. They looked at the email address and it said it was from the car dealer, but the email was slightly different and the URL wasn't quite right. This one didn't have a phone number on it where all the other ones had phone numbers. So they called the dealer and the dealer said, that's not us. So this car buyer called our agent back and said, thank you for saving me $40,000. I'll remember you in the future. So it's these big purchases that the scammers are trying to grab the money. And it's unfortunate, but we just have to be very wary of all of this.
No, that's great. Thank you. And this is why we're doing this. That's why I wanted to do this topic first. I think this is so important. I hope that agents can listen and hear these things. And I hope we have more stories like that where there's a ripple effect, because it's really horrible. It's really sad. We've had things happen to us. I'm seeing things from an accounting perspective that I've never seen happen. And it's just so frustrating when you're so diligent, which most people are. I know all of our agents are. I know we are. I know attorneys are. And I know obviously the consumer is as well. But like you said, that's, when you don't do something like this every day, it's not going to come as naturally to be like, So I hope this was helpful. I think that just taking that piece away about nothing is that urgent, pick up the phone, call a brokerage, get somebody on the phone to tell you that that is accurate information. You would rather be safe than sorry. You would rather have somebody just say, yeah, that's what I told you I was going to send you. Well, I want to be safe, right? We want those phone calls. What we don't want is to find out that you wired money somewhere and we can't get it back.
And really, one of the things that keep in mind is any sudden change has to be looked at suspiciously. Mm-hmm. If the real estate broker, you're working with a Gibson agent, they're going to say, you're going to get a secured email from our accounting department. Well, that's not going to change. It's not going to go from a secured email, and after you've confirmed the information, an unsecured email is going to come from the accounting department. So any kind of sudden change, and if you are working with an attorney's office and you're wiring money to the attorney and you've called them and you've confirmed their wire instructions or they've confirmed yours, and then the next day you get an email saying something's changed, then there has to be another phone call. Sudden changes are typically going to be a red flag that you should be paying attention to, both as a real estate broker and as a consumer, because these changes really don't happen. And if they do happen, there's going to be a phone call saying, we've got to change.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Richard. This is so helpful. I really think that we have these conversations so regularly that we forget that it might not feel as obvious to everybody else. So I hope it was helpful to everyone that's listening. Please feel free to share with anyone it would be relevant to. And I'm really excited. I think we're going to do these kind of on a monthly basis, Richard, where you can share some stories and hopefully we can help people get out ahead of some headaches from a legal standpoint.
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.